So up next, we are going to be having a very important conversation about something that I think a lot of folks in the community are talking about, and that is how is it that we get better at solving crimes. And so I'm happy to introduce our very own Dr. Will Cooley, and who is our panel's moderator and panelist Marc, Krupanski, Representative Frazier, and Deputy Chief Emily Olson.
All right, welcome everyone. Thanks so much. Third panel here. We're going to get right to it because we want to hear from the folks up here. In Minnesota solves 47% of crimes reported to the police. That's less than half. The Minnesota Justice Research Center, and I think everyone in this room says we can do better. So that's what we're focused on today. And like Kayla said, we've got 3 panelists up here. I'm going to go right to the Q&A. So my first question is for Cedrick Frazier, representative, state representative from the New Hope area. So Cedrick, could you please talk about growing up in Englewood on the south side of Chicago? We hear a lot about over-policing in neighborhoods like that. But when did you first notice that people were not being held accountable when they committed violent crimes?
Thank you, Will. Hey, and thanks everybody for being here today, and I'm glad to be here to have this conversation. Anybody in here from Chicago? All right. West Side. I got cousins on the West Side. I'm just trying to get a sense, though, for if people can, when I paint this picture, people to understand kind of where I grew up on the south side of Chicago. Englewood, blue-collar, poor, working-class community. Those numbers you just, the 47%, I don't even know if the solved crime rates was that high. When I was growing up. And I grew up in the late 70s through the 80s and then through the early 90s before I came here to Minnesota. I would say probably at an age in my adolescence, I started seeing that what we did know was there was a heavy police presence. We did know that. And in many cases, right, we believe and we've been told that to translate to safer communities. But what we saw, obviously, in our communities was crime rates were obviously high. Gun violence, drug dealing, gang violence. And what we would often see is that when those crimes happen, oftentimes a community member would know the person that committed the crime, would see the person that committed the crime. After the crime was committed, and the thought was always, why with such a heavy police presence, why aren't folks being held accountable? We didn't really answer for that. But what we knew was, if the system wasn't working for us, if the community, it's a difference to police a community as opposed to being the entity that is policing to care for and to protect the community. And that's a lot of what I did not experience that growing up in Chicago. Now, do I think that all officers were bad? No. I think there were some policy decisions made in Chicago, if folks know Chicago, that were absolutely put in place to ensure that certain communities were safe and that certain crime that was in certain communities did not go outside of those communities. And I lived in a community like that. Heavy police presence, keeping things within the boundaries of that community, but it did not translate into safer communities for everyone. What it meant was, when I would go to school in the morning, I would have to traverse neighborhoods differently to stay safe. It meant that my mom was often worried, sick about me if I was going to come home safe from school that evening. And I'm sadly, community I grew up in Englewood, a lot of that has not changed. Now, I do think there's a lot of work that we can do together to change those situations. But Will, to your point, seeing crime, knowing crime was committed, but not seeing those individuals that committed those crimes held accountable, it created great distrust within the system. It created a cycle of violence within those communities that still maintains today.
Yeah, and I think last we saw in Chicago, 6% of non-fatal shootings are solved. Is that right, Quentin? About 6%? Yeah, roughly, yeah. So we have a living victim in these cases, yet only 6% are solved. So a lot of these problems remain with us. So I'm going to turn now to Marc Krupanski, Director of Criminal Justice Policy at Arnold Ventures. So the case for law enforcement solving these crimes seems obvious, but it really hasn't been a priority for politicians, the public, maybe even law enforcement for a long time. Why is that?
Thanks, Will, and thank you all for having me here today, joining this conversation. You know, I think this question kind of gets to the heart of this conversation here, which is when we look at the statistics, the clearance rate or the rate of solving a crime has been stagnant, really decreasing for a number of years now, so that's not new. What is new is we're having this conversation, and hopefully in an open and honest way. And I also just want to be clear, it's also not about blaming the police department, it's not about blaming communities, but to Representative's point, we have a system that we built that hasn't been designed and hasn't been resourced sufficiently to prioritize solving crimes. But in terms of why, you know, there's a number of reasons. I could talk all day, you know, just highlighting a few. I think historically we've prioritized severity of punishment over the swiftness and certainty of punishment. So for decades, American public safety strategy has really been driven on a visceral reaction of we need tougher, harsher sentences. But what we know from research is that the best way to deter a crime is swift and certain punishment rather than severity. So what this means as a very basic example is if I'm about to commit a crime, especially a violent crime, I'm more likely to think, am I going to get caught versus am I going to get a 10 or 15-year sentence? But political incentives haven't matched up with this. It's very, you know, being able to run an election campaign if you're an elected official on a new harsh sentence bill that you pass is a lot easier than talking about caseloads for detectives or solve rates for non-fatal shootings. So investigations have been overshadowed. I think the other thing is it does come as a surprise to many people. When I talk about this issue with folks, my friends and family, they're shocked. You know, when I say, what do you think the national clearance rate for homicides are? You know, meaning the chance that somebody's going to get arrested. And they usually think it's in the high 80s or 90s, and we're shocked to learn that it was 52%, 60% now nationally. It's basically a coin flip. And if you go to non-fatal shootings, that can drop down to 30, 20%. Chicago, unfortunately, even lower. Property crimes, even lower than that. And so I think general public has generally thought we've been doing a better job at this. In some part, I think this is due to the media culture. You got shows like Law & Order, CSI, 25 spin-offs, where police departments are well-resourced, they have all the technology, the forensic team is cooperating, and you can solve complex crimes very quickly, but that's not what's happening. And so just quickly, you know, I think two other quick points is that it's hard work. In order to solve crimes, it takes well-trained detectives, staff, you know, adequate staffing, modern technology, forensic capacities, and community trust. And these are things that have not really been invested in. And then the other part is around data. You know, data really drives accountability. And most jurisdictions don't have data on this information, especially the details of like, what is the time to an investigative lead or caseload? And these are things that elected officials can use to help drive resources more appropriately. The example I give, you know, if we even talk about crime rates, Minnesota has a great law requiring crime data to be reported, but many jurisdictions don't. And I often look at the statistics around hog slaughtering, so the number of pigs that are killed in a week. I can tell you this, and I looked it up on my way here. This past week, it was 2,716,000. But I can't tell you with any certainty in the past week how many homicides happened, how many non-fatal shootings happened, how many crimes happened, how many solving, and there's something fundamentally off when we don't have this information.
So let's talk about staffing. We have Deputy Chief Olson here from the Minneapolis Police Department. She gave a recent presentation to the City Council. I would say about 70 investigators short. I would actually go more than that. I would say more like 100. We need 100 investigators in the city of Minneapolis. So as you rebuild the ranks, what are you looking for in a quality investigator that can do that hard work that Marc was talking about?
I would say that one of the most important things I'm looking for in somebody is compassion. You have to be compassionate to your victims and to your witnesses, but there's a line you have to teeter, and that takes experience, and that's what I need. So these new cops that are coming on are great, and I'm glad we're getting them, and that fills that position that we have to have, which is patrol. We have to answer those 911 calls. But what I'm looking for is, I always equate it to a doctor. When they come in and let's say you have a boil on your knee, you don't want that doctor to come in and say, oh my God, that is disgusting. That is the worst thing I've ever seen. I've never seen anything like it. You don't want them to say that. You want them to say, oh, okay, I've seen that before. I can handle that. Don't worry about it. And that's the same thing I want my investigators to do. A certain coldness, a certain roboticness. Don't worry about it. I've got it. I can handle this. But you have to be empathetic. This is the worst day for them. And that's where we see everyone, is their worst day. And so you want the tenacity to always keep going. Okay, you've hit a roadblock. That's okay. Find something else. You got to keep going. What else can we do? I need them to be able to work with other people, sit down with them. I've hit a roadblock. Can you help me? What else can I do? And then they need to be technologically savvy. We have to be able to use new things, new ways. And nowadays, there's video everywhere, and there's cell phones, and there's AI, and there's all kinds of things that we can lean on, but they have to be able to use them. I remember when I was an investigator, the guy that worked behind me, he's long since retired, so don't worry, he's gone. But he wrote a report, and our boss got mad at him because it was so poorly written. And he said, well, I don't know what I'm supposed to do about that. I said, well, you could use spell check. And he said, well, mine doesn't have that. And I said, okay, so your word doesn't have that. He said, no, it doesn't. So I have to run that tightrope of, I really want new cops who are tenacious and can do things, but still have that experience and want them to move forward. So that's really what I'm looking for, is that tightrope balance. And it's there. I have it. I have really great cops. I don't have enough, but I do have great ones.
So Cedrick, if everyone knows, Cedrick is running for Hennepin County prosecutor. There's arrest, there's charge, and then there's conviction. It's a whole process, right? But we want good arrests, we want good charges, and we want real convictions. We don't want to be here 20 years later and have a whole bunch of exonerations. So there's danger in focusing too much on the clearance rate, right? So how does the Hennepin County prosecutor take the lead on this and making sure people are held accountable when they commit these crimes?
I think that's really about developing a partnership. And we were talking about this earlier about the communication, the collaboration. I think the county attorneys, the prosecutors know what evidence we need to solve those cases. I think getting in early, partnering with our partners with law enforcement, working up to and making sure that they understand when they're doing an investigation, here's what we need to move this case up in a court of law and to make sure that these convictions stick. And make sure we're doing this the right way, right? We do want to make sure we're doing it the right way, because what we don't want is to either jack the case up and then we have someone back in the community that can continue to cause harm, continue to terrorize the community, or convict the wrong individual, and then we have to correct that issue down the line. And in the conversations that I've been having with folks, no one wants the first or the second thing to happen, right? So I believe that collaboration up front, working together, if that means embedding prosecutors with certain units, we're working on non-fatal crimes to ensure that we find that information that we need to prosecute those cases and track folks down and solve those things. And then ultimately, my biggest thing is we want to make sure that we're doing this as efficiently, quickly as possible to bring some peace and closure to those victims. That's a big deal. When we can bring peace and closure to the victims, we can then build trust, which leads to folks actually being more communicative when things are happening in their community, which can then lead to raising the rates of us solving those crimes.
So Marc, can you talk a little bit more about this? Because we do want the clearance rate to come up, but I think there's some unintended consequences there, and we've seen it when things get too data-driven. We know about perhaps the story in New York when they focused heavily on data-driven results, and what precinct commanders would do was move people who are committing crimes into other precincts and say, look, my precinct is now crime-free, right? So I think there's some dangers in this. So how do we make sure that we're getting good stats when we're doing this data-driven analysis?
Yeah, sure. So I think you're talking about CompStat, and it's critically important that we learn both the good and the bad. So that we can do the good and not repeat the bad. And you're completely right. When we talk about clearance rates is a useful goal, but it's really just a benchmark. It's an indicator. It doesn't mean anything if you're not investing in supporting agencies to be able to deliver it. Data itself, I always say data should guide strategy. It should not become the strategy. And that's when we start getting into trouble. So, CompStat was rolled out really in the 1990s in New York City. It was unique at the time because it was really focused on problem solving rather than performance. And so the kind of brilliance on it wasn't really the spreadsheets on the data. It was that it was using data in order to try to identify and solve problems. And so initially it was really being used as a way for especially mid-level supervisors to be able to be more analytical and strategic in terms of identifying crime trends and patterns and then figure out the best strategy to go about addressing it. But over time that culture shifted and it became more about performance, more about a scorecard. And when you have a scorecard in policing, that's when you then end up gaming the system. And so for CompStat, it's like what you talked about. We saw downgrading of crimes or misfiling or not filing reports, lowering the classification of certain incidents. And so the same risk can be with clearance rates as well. I think we can say we want you to meet this target of a higher clearance rate, but if we're not coupling that with supporting increased training for detectives, staffing, technology, forensic support, investing in community trust, then what we're doing is we're building pressure without support, and pressure without support leads to shortcuts. And so shortcuts in clearance rates can look like relying on exceptional clearances. So usually when you clear a case, that's through an arrest, but there's a category of exceptional clearance, which means you know who it was, but you couldn't arrest them, or maybe they were dead if it was a murder-suicide or things like this. But it's often not defined, so you could see that category being used more. You can also see arresting people on weak evidence or focusing on easier to solve crimes than the harder ones. So yeah, I think again on this, the clearance rate is really just the target. As the representative said, when we talk with communities, they want folks held accountable, but they want the right person and they want that to be quick and fair. So it's critical not to lose track of that.
And I'll remind the audience, if you have questions, you got the note cards, please write them down. Yeah, we've already got some out there, so that's great. I'm going to leave time at the end. So, Deputy Chief Olson, one of the things we find, especially with non-fatal shootings, is we have uncooperative victims. I've read stories about, police officer comes to the scene, person is bleeding, shot, and the thing they say to the police officer is, I will handle this myself, right? And I think that's partly a trust issue, but it's partly what Cedrick was talking about. When these things don't get solved, the community solves them themselves, but that leads to these cycles of violence. So as you're bringing up this next generation of investigators, how do you deal with this situation where sometimes the victim doesn't want your help?
So we put into place a process when we have an uncooperative victim, and we have 2 civilian investigators, and they were both from the community that we hired them. One was in the system and one was not. And so we assign them the case originally, and then they look for other ways to solve it, whether it be video or shot spotter or other technological ways. And they'll also reach out to witnesses. Can we get a statement from them? Maybe they're cooperative. And we'll try and do some solving of the case without the victim. And then if we get something, we'll assign an sworn investigator to the case. And then we'll go back to the victim or the victim's family to see if we can get some traction on the case, to see if we could maybe solve it that way. And even if the victim doesn't want to cooperate, at least we're going back to the victim and saying, we've done some work on the case anyway. Here's what we have. We would be able to move forward with the case if you're willing to help us, to let them know that we worked on it, to let them know that we could possibly identify a suspect and that we're vested in the case. And that's kind of the approach that we're taking for right now, to see if that will do some good, both with community trust as well as maybe establishing a process when we do have an uncooperative victim.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm seeing from the questions already, and Deputy Chief Olson mentioned this, civilian investigators, right, and the role. We recently talked to Baltimore. I'm seeing this in the questions. They have 90 civilian investigators. Now, they can't do certain things, nor should they, right? They can't make arrests. They shouldn't be on the scene if it's dangerous, right? But there is a role to be played for these civilian investigators, and we can talk about that more later on in our conversation. But I'm going to go back to you, Cedrick. You're the sponsor of House Bill 2742, which is a grant program to help cities solve these non-fatal shootings. St. Paul has used state money to solve non-fatal shootings. They went from solving about 30% to solving 70% by cooperation. And so Cedrick has sponsored this bill to try to spread that throughout the state. However, what we're hearing is that this is not the state's responsibility. The state is in charge of prisons. The state is in charge of corrections. Policing is a local matter. They don't need the state helping them out. How do you respond to that?
Well, I actually think one of our jobs as a state legislator is public safety. So I would respond and say it is part of our job as legislators to make sure we're doing things, providing resources and creating structures and systems that absolutely make sure every community is safe. And for me, as a problem solver, I look at what's happening. You see lowest clearance rates. You're talking to community members. You see the harm that is being done there. You see the cycles that are continuing to be done there. You figure out what are ways we can stop this or at least disrupt it to make communities safer. And carrying this bill was one of those ways. And in fact, a lot of the legislation that I've carried has been focused on just that. How do we put resources in places, maybe different than what we've done before, get a little bit creative and find some alternative ways, and also in conjunction with law enforcement and city officials, and put the resources and targeted resources to help make communities safe. And this grant program, to me, would do just that. What we often hear, oftentimes, and you could probably speak to this, what we often hear sometimes is that we need more resources. We need more resources so we can bring in more folks, so we can bring in more strategies and programmings to make our community safe. This program would focus, these grant programs would focus specifically on that. We're not telling you how to do your job, but we're saying we're putting resources here to help you solve a problem that you have not been able to solve yet, and that does not create the safe communities that we want for everybody.
Marc, as we build this Minneapolis model of policing, this commitment to progress, what examples can we learn from other cities in terms of raising clearance rates ethically?
So first, Minneapolis is not alone. Pretty much every jurisdiction I'm aware of is struggling with this as well. And it's good to look at examples. We really push around trying to look at what is evidence-based rather than just what sounds good or talks to our particular ideology or beliefs. But we're seeing some movement that we can draw on. So one, there's a national effort called the National Case Closed Project. It's run in partnership with the Department of Justice. They've been supporting some jurisdictions like New Orleans around basically starting over, helping train their detectives, bringing on and training civilian analysts, looking at caseload distribution so that they're more right-sized, and we've seen there some progress in improving the clearance rates. Another big part is focus on non-fatal shootings. So jurisdictions like Denver is really leading the way where they're treating non-fatal shootings as homicides. Oftentimes non-fatal shootings are not as prioritized in investigations, often because of the resources that are available. But really, the only difference between a fatal and a non-fatal shooting is a degree of inches. Sometimes it's about how fast you can get somebody to an ER. And we know from non-fatal shootings it can often, spur a retaliatory cycle of violence. So they're treating non-fatal shootings as homicides, but also as prevention. And so creating a dedicated unit to focus on non-fatal shootings to solve those. Also partnering with some programs like hospital-based violence intervention as a way to then not just solve those crimes, but then hopefully prevent homicides as well. And Denver's made incredible strides on that. They've also, in Denver, and I believe in Philadelphia, have started creating public-facing dashboards that detail all the information related to case management, so that the elected officials are able to monitor that and hopefully provide support when needed. And the last is really forensics. So it's not just on the police department, The forensics team, so the crime lab, which sometimes is in the police department, sometimes it's outside, depending on the jurisdiction, is facing enormous backlogs. And so that, if there's ballistics or biological evidence like DNA, blood, and you send it to a lab and you're waiting, we work in Houston, Texas, and they're waiting 12 months to get DNA back, which is, it's obscene, and that really delays an investigation. So we're seeing now some increased investments in being able to hire forensic analysts, DNA analysts. There's now the use of rapid DNA machines. The FBI has issued approved the use of rapid DNA machines for suspect sampling, but also for crime scenes, to be able to now, you can automate this so you can get a return within 90 minutes, which can be a big game changer. So those are some ways I would say is really looking at how you manage treating non-fatal shootings as homicides, partnering with a hospital-based violence intervention, reporting data out to elected officials, and then really supporting your forensic capacity.
So we're talking about building trust, and I see this from the questions a lot. How can the police department build trust? Well, I think that's really hard to do when we don't solve these crimes, because then the community says they don't care about us. I think, Cedrick, that's where you started us, right? In Minneapolis right now, there's 14 detectives doing all the homicides, all the non-fatal shootings, all the suicides, and all the overdoses. We think there should probably be about 33 investigators just doing non-fatal shootings. If we're going to treat them like homicides, and your caseload should be about 5, we should have about 33. I think in the newspaper recently it said there should be 12 domestic violence investigators. The city has about 5, right? So very short-staffed in Minneapolis. Hard to build that trust when we're so short-staffed in terms of quality investigators that do the work. Deputy Chief Olson, we can't say, in 10 years we'll be fully staffed, right? In 20 years we'll be fully staffed when we finally get these good investigators. So what are some things that we can do now? And maybe this is a question for the entire panel. How can we think creatively? So when someone gets shot in the city of Minneapolis, that is treated like a homicide. That this is a very serious thing, and we need to hold the person accountable that shot that person. Tough question, but people would want answers now. What are some things we can do in the short term, because the Minneapolis Police Department probably won't be staffed up fully for a long time?
Well, I'm lucky I have a really good homicide team. So the non-fatal shootings are treated much like homicides because they get a homicide team assigned to them. I also have a on-call team as well. So not a homicide team, but an on-call investigative team, and they respond to every single shooting. So an investigator does go to the scene on every single shooting, and that's in place. I think that for now, and I did have a non-fatal shooting team at one point, but I did have to combine them. I just didn't have the staff anymore. I couldn't hold both homicide and non-fatal shooting team. For now, what we're trying to do is really lean on our technology and try our best to supplement through our intel. So have our intel look at video and have our intel give us that information and really lean in on that to try and supplement all of the work that has to be done on these cases. We also have community navigators that are embedded into investigations, and what they do is some of the outreach work that we just don't have the time to do. So updating families and updating victims and asking witnesses questions. And we have contractors through the Neighborhood Safety Department. That's the OCS side of the department of the city. And we've asked them to partner with us and help us to do some of the outreach, which I think is really important, and it does matter with the trust piece of the community, because if they don't trust us, they won't talk to us. And we know that in investigations how important it is that the city does trust us and the people that we're working with do trust us. And I have said, I do agree wholeheartedly. It's not that I don't think clearance rates are important. I do. I think they're very important. It is an important metrics. But when I took over as commander, so not in this position, but the commander of violent crimes, I did sit down with my leadership what's most important to me as the leader of violent crimes is that my victims and survivors are getting a touch point. It's very important to me that my investigators are calling the victims and making sure that they have contact with them and that they feel respected and they feel heard. And I think that is very important. So I just want to make sure that that's happening. So I just wanted to say that although I do think clear stories are very important, I don't know that they're the most important.
I just want to put another quick pitch for Baltimore civilian investigators. Part of the reason we got into this work is we were talking to a Minneapolis homicide detective, and he said mothers are calling in, asking for updates. We don't have time to call them back, right? Well, maybe we don't need the homicide investigator to call that person back. Maybe we can have these civilian investigators do some of that work, collect evidence, do the fingerprinting, things like that, right? I was impressed, and we should think more about that. But anything else? This is a tough question. What can we do now?
It is a tough question. Thank you for what you added to that. I think, outside of being able to staff up in the way that the research is saying we need to be staffed up to address these issues, I think then you look at where you can put resources in other places, right? Even if it's not a civilian investigator, but you've got folks, community outreach folks, or you're working closely with community groups that already exist. I mean, there are many organizations embedded within these communities that know these communities, that are from these communities, that when they speak, when they step in the room, when they have conversations, they have built-in credibility already. That can go a long way in disrupting the cycle, right? If you have a crime that happens, and where I grew up from, we say, hey, there's going to be some get back, right? But to stop that get back, if you got some people in the community that can have those conversations, say, hey, look, we're working on this. Here's what the investigators are doing now. Here's what we're looking now. Here's the lead that we have now. And folks knowing that there is progress happening within that case could solve some of that. Also resources where if you can give resources to the victims, maybe you got to get them out of that community. You got to give them a hotel room or get them somewhere where they're not still in that environment to where they're going to be in that circle of violence that continue to happen. Or they're going to be in that community knowing that they know someone who did it and they can see him, so they're going to take it into their own hands to get that get back that I talked about. So I think those type of resources, refocusing them to where you can in those situations can go a long way to disrupting that cycle of violence that is often, when you talked about the non-fatal piece of it, that often leads to actual fatal shooting. And so we want to work as quickly as possible to disrupt that so we don't end up with an actual fatal shooting because we're not able to solve the non-fatal as soon as possible.
Yeah, just to bold, underline the points too on witness support and relocation. California is one state where they have a pretty robust witness support fund that police departments can access directly in order to move people into a safe place during the course of investigation. It's critically important. But otherwise, yeah, civilian analysts, I think, back to your point on Ward, I'm often talking, colleagues here talk with police departments. I'm like, who's your data guy? And it's like, oh, it's the guy who knew Word had spell check, right? And so I think being able to hire, bringing on civilians, that can do data analysis, not just tell you what the data is, but actually synthesize it and be able to give that out is critically important. And technology is not the solution, but it can certainly help. And there are new technologies that are controversial that haven't been fully evaluated, but are being deployed. Things like drones as first responders, if you're not able to get somebody out there, and surveillance cameras as well, and how that's being used to track shootings.
And I think that speaks to one of the questions. One of the questions here was on the culture of snitches get stitches, right? And how can we support witnesses and make sure they feel comfortable and supported through the process when they do see something and they feel frightened or feel like they're not going to be supported. So I think this speaks to some of those. So there's another question here. Tension between different government bodies in Hennepin County. Prosecutor doesn't trust the police don't trust the prosecutor, police don't interact with the sheriff's department, whatever it may be, right? And I do think this is an important one, especially probably for Cedrick and Deputy Chief Olson, because what we did see in St. Paul, again, St. Paul, non-fatal shootings from 30% clearance to 70% clearance, the prosecutor, the sheriff, the police department, and all the suburban police departments got in the room together and said, we're going to prioritize this. Now, they also got $6 million from the state to do so, right? Quite the incentive to do that. But it's real, Cedrick. There's just not a lot of cooperation in Hennepin County. what can we do?
I think one is just building those relationships, communicating, being in the same room, understanding that you can disagree, but you don't always have to be disagreeable. We may not agree on how we want to get to a place, but understanding we have a common goal, and that common goal is solving crimes, holding people accountable, and keeping our communities safe. And I know that work can be hard. That work can be hard because we have big personalities, and we have folks that have been doing this for a long time that believe they know exactly what they're doing. But I do believe it can be done. And that's much of the work that's going to have to be done is to, like they're doing in Ramsey County, is to make sure that we can pick up the phone and talk to each other. We can sit in rooms together and have those conversations and then work toward that common goal. And what I can say is there's no silver bullet for any of this stuff, right? It's really just going to take that hard work of working together, cooperating, and rebuilding that trust and then maintaining that trust within those relationships. I often say that when we work together, there should never be any blind sides. There should never be any surprises. Even if we don't agree on something, if we're moving forward with a policy or an issue, you will know what it is. And we're going to work together as much as possible to move in the same direction, but there won't be any surprises on that. And at the end of the day, we all have a common goal of making sure our communities are as safe as possible.
Yes. You know, I would say that much of what you see in the news is just big personalities. The investigators and the attorneys, they do get along really swimmingly. I think that my presentation to the city council went very well.
There's a couple hiccups at the start, but it went better.
I am so pleasant. I think, yes, we have a common goal. I think if I just keep saying his words, it's just he's so much prettier to look at than me. I just feel like I don't know. You look at his smile, and I don't know what to. It's
Marc?
Should we leave? I don't know.
I just feel like I shouldn't have worn this. I should have worn street clothes. It would have been better, and I would have seemed much nicer. It makes me look big.
Okay, Marc, I'm getting a lot of questions here that we're focusing on the wrong thing, that we should be root causes, underinvestment in communities. Some people are going back to Cedrick's starting off, well, you have a marginalized community, right? We're focusing on the wrong things by looking at clearance rates. How do you respond? And I think this comes up a lot, especially from academics, I think, right? Let's focus on root causes where people are not shooting in the first place instead of focusing on this.
Sure, and they still are shooting, so we have to do both.
Yeah, just let me say that. Look, we've got a lot of guns in this country. A lot of them are in communities, and particularly in impoverished communities, like the one I grew up in Chicago, and there are absolutely communities like this in Minnesota, and not just in the metro area, right? I know that from the work that I've done at the state level, looking at where crime spots are. It's not just in particular places in Minneapolis and St. Paul. So we know that for a fact. And what we also know is that there is a correlation between the affluency of those communities and the violence and the violent crime within those communities. So we absolutely have to look at root causes. One of the reasons I worked on the legislation that I worked on at the state legislature was I had a bill. We had the largest investment in community violence prevention that we've ever done in the state. And someone asked me, well, why are you working on that right here in this public safety space? At the time, I was the vice chair of public safety. And I said, because this is the space that I'm in. And so I wanted to focus on, it was a way to focus on some of the root cause issues from a public safety lens and perspective. And absolutely, if we can address those things, right, and this is what we felt as a country, if we can address those root cause issues, we can address housing affordability, if we can address better outcomes in schooling, right, if we can address better jobs for folks, it will solve a lot of these problems, but we haven't figured that out. So what we have to look at absolutely now is that we have an issue in front of us. And if it's non-fatal shootings, which is causing the cycle of violence to continue, we can target that issue. But at the same time, still talk about how do we put policies in places to resource and address and attack those root cause issues. And then I agree, I do think we have to do both. We're here to talk about this issue because we know this issue is absolutely a problem that continues to cycle the violence. But we also need to be having that higher level umbrella issue of how do we address the root cause issues, because that is something just as a country. I mean, it goes way back to Lyndon Johnson, right, and the war on poverty, right, that ever really got off the ground. We just have not solved an issue that we need to solve.
Yeah, and I would applaud. How do I support your campaign for prosecutor? For me, I would say also is that when we get into data in many jurisdictions, we do see that some victims have their crimes solved more than others. There's racial disparities in here, right? So black male homicide victims are less likely to have their murder solved than white victims. And to me, this is also a fundamental part of how a democracy should function. When we have a, criminal justice system, public safety system, it should be serving all residents. And so we're doing this pretty well in some communities and not in others, and that's a problem that we need to fix. And so that to me is where it's not, if we're just avoiding this, there is a fundamental racial justice issue here that we're not dealing with, that we should begin to deal with more seriously.
Yeah, and I'm seeing a lot of questions on accountability on that issue, right? How to hold police accountable. Maybe you've heard about the 40%er, the homicide detective who consistently solves about 40% of cases. Well, just about anybody could solve 40% of cases. The person who's either on the scene or domestic violence, where it's pretty clear it's the boyfriend or the husband. How do we make sure we're getting quality investigators in these situations? And not the 40%er, is there different ways we should be promoting people into investigations, for instance, right? It shouldn't be a matter of seniority. I've worked in the department for 10 years. I now get to be a homicide detective, right? Should we be rethinking that to make sure that we're getting quality people rather than just someone who's been in the department for 10 years and just can't do the job or won't do the job? I guess maybe I'll go to you first, Emily and Marc, if you have any ideas on how do we make sure we're getting quality people in these roles?
Well, we don't do it that way. So it doesn't matter how long you've been on. You have to be a supervisor actually to be in investigations. So you have to promote to sergeant in order to be in investigations. And then once you are in investigations, you have to serve at least 2 years in some kind of investigative capacity, and then you're interviewed. And you have to present a case before you're able to go to homicide. So homicide is kind of the top level tier, but even to go into investigations, you're chosen in order to go into investigations. And I am a part of that, but essentially the chief makes that decision. He chooses who goes to investigations. I will present to him some names and my thoughts on that, but that's his decision. But it's not a matter of you're just on 10 years. I do want quality candidates, and we do have a onboarding system to train them, and then I send them, every single one of them, to an investigation, to training sessions on, we do search warrants, and we do interviewing, and we do crime scene, and so there's probably 5 different things I send them to training on.
Marc, you want to talk about this? Because I know you're working on this at the national level, training the next generation of great investigators.
Sure. So it is true. It's great to hear what's happening in Minneapolis. Many jurisdictions don't have that. And there's no standardized training. So we're supporting a project with PERF, the Police Executive Research Forum, one of the national leading police associations, where they're developing now a curriculum that will be rolled out. We're going to develop a curriculum for not just detectives, but then the supervisors of detectives and investigators, and then pilot this in a randomized control trials that we can evaluate what the effect is. But I think a lot of the things in terms of training, but a critical part is the supervision. So what is actually being reported out, collected in terms of their performance? It's hard there's a lot of, what do you say? There's a lot of poor workers in every industry, and police department included. Unions make it difficult to really hold officers accountable, and it can be hard to move them out, but not impossible. But it really does begin with greater supervision over that.
Cedrick, I'm going to direct this one to you, and it's a tough one, but it's come up on about 3 note cards here, right? We're talking about building community trust. We're talking about solving crimes. Meanwhile, we have masked people going through our neighborhoods with police on their shirts, smashing car windows, pulling people out of their cars, right? Detaining people at their workplaces. I know this is a federal issue, but it's going to be tough, right? It's going to be tough if you are a Hennepin County prosecutor someday to say, we got to have trust in the police, and meanwhile we have this situation going on.
We do have to have trust in order to work towards having safer communities. What I can say, like I said, as a state legislator, this is something that we're looking at. How do we prevent folks from walking around masked, unidentifiable, and harming the community in that way? So we're looking at some legislation to address that, to prevent at least the mask part and not being identifiable within the community. It's a federal thing. We're going to see what we can do here as a state. We've seen some other states do this. I think California has done something recently, and some other states are doing things around this, because it makes your job harder, right? When we've got folks coming into the community that are not our local law enforcement, but they're absolutely portraying themselves to be, they are law enforcement, but they're not our local law enforcement, and they're harming the community in that way. It makes it harder for our local law enforcement agencies to do the work they're doing. It makes it even harder for our communities to trust our local law enforcement agencies, because oftentimes you see them as one and the same. And so we're looking at some things to do. We're going to be having that conversation when we're back in session in February to work on that. But for me, it will be, I think, for the county attorney, in tandem with law enforcement, is in the community, make sure you're assuring them that you're not a part of that, and finding ways to work together to maintain the relationships that you do have.
Marc, I'm seeing a question here about really long prison sentences, right? And talking to folks about what you brought up earlier, this the question about mandatory minimums, especially with maybe more moderate or conservative folks. Like, how do you talk to them about that and say, your long prison sentences are not effective, especially if we're not solving crimes? How do you shift our resources from life sentences, excessively long sentences, to invest in the type of things that we're clearly lacking here in Hennepin County?
I was hoping you'd have an answer to that. I'm still trying to figure it out. I mean, the public safety dollars are, even though they can be immense, are finite. And so it is a question of how do you want to allocate them, and what is the return. So there's a lot of conversations you can talk about, cost-benefit analysis about how much it costs to lock somebody up, putting them in for life, on taxpayer dollars. You can talk about the public safety benefits. I think the the wall that I often hit, though, is that some people feel like, well, this is just a matter of almost like vengeance. We need to have this and this stiff penalty. And it's somewhat of a, maybe it's a moral belief in some ways that's hard to argue against. But I think largely what we really try to focus on is like the fiscal impact, because longer sentences have an immense fiscal impact. We know, also in terms of once, people for the most part are not held for life, and they're going to come back out into communities. So how are they being supported in that way? What are the consequences from a longer sentence for, not just for them, but their family, their community, to have them being taken out. So we try different ways. I think a big part is if we can partner with law enforcement to call for, greater resources in terms of the investigations. If we're going to put our dollars to solving crimes rather than the severity, then that's useful as well. But ultimately, the severity doesn't matter if you're not catching people. So it's also, it sounds good, but in the end, you're not actually getting the people that you think you are.
Yeah, and last year it was HF7. I don't know what it'll be this year, but there is a bill that it just lengthens sentence for everything in Minnesota, right? And talk about the fiscal cost. I think 2 new prisons is what it would require in the state of Minnesota to actually do that. But it'll be back again this year, right?
Well, if I could just, to this point, I think I often say accountability has its place, but then we have to create a pathway or runway back into the community, because most folks do come back into the community, right? And when we have that, oftentimes we have that, people understand that, people get that, right? And the cost is when you have someone tethered to a system, our criminal justice system, for 20 to 30 years of their life, we all pay the cost for that. That's a cost we all pay. And people often get that, right? And particularly in Minnesota, we understand, like, there's a dearth of workers for particular industries. And the collateral damage of having any kind of contact with the criminal justice system means that you're usually shut off from those opportunities. But if we can find ways to create the pathway back into the community and provide training, resources for those folks to be back in a positive way, that helps us all out as a community and as a society.
So big stack of excellent questions here, and I hope I'm kind of summarizing them and grouping them a little bit. Deputy Olson, I think this one goes to you. So I think there's some confusion on what a civilian investigator can do, or professional staff can do, and what sworn officers can do. Can you kind of clarify that for folks? I know this came up with the last panel too, like what's appropriate and what's actually legal in terms of civilian investigators versus sworn officers?
Yeah, my civilian investigators are really, really important, and they do very important functions, but what they cannot do is they can't write search warrants. They can't do JPC statements, which is a judicial probable cause statement, so they can't do a probable cause statement. They can't put out a PC pickups, meaning I want this person picked up for the crime. They can't go to crime scenes. I don't allow them to even go look at video by themselves. I make them take someone sworn in case something happens. I don't want them to be unsafe. They can't do a suspect interview, and they can't present charges to the county. So if we get to a point where it's time to present those charges to the county, they can't send those over. So essentially, they can't investigate a case by themselves. So they are really a support staff, but that role is very important. If you think about, I parked my car last night and I went inside, I had dinner, I went to bed, and when I came out this morning, my car was gone. And oftentimes there's very little evidence, there's no witnesses, there's nothing to go on. But let's say they had video right outside their house and it was pointed right at the car. Great. But you have to watch that video from the time they left that car to the time they went out in the morning. So let's say that's 12, 13 hours. You do have to watch all 13 hours of that video. Somebody has to do that. And oftentimes the civilian investigator is tasked with that kind of work, and it does really relieve the investigator from a lot of those duties. And so they are incredibly useful and helpful, and they're wonderful. And a lot of them have come from various backgrounds, and it's been a gift to have them on the floor.
So I can feel my belly rumbling, and that means it's just about time. So I'm going to just ask each panelist just to leave us with one thing, one takeaway that they would like you to go back with, right? The community to go back with. So one thing that they want you to remember from this panel. Cedrick, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing would be we do have the ability to solve the problems that we have in our communities and make our communities safer. It is hard work. It's tough work. I mentioned earlier about big personalities. We have those, but at the end of the day, I do believe we're all trying to go in the same direction to make our community safer. And I would just have to say, we have to trust that we all want to go in that same direction and give each other grace with that.
Yeah, I would say start asking what your clearance rates are, looking for data around caseload distribution, but just remembering the data is just as a point. It really matters in terms of how well the department's supported and looking at other ways to advance solving crime. But for me, what really intrigues me on this is it is a matter of justice, but it is also the deterrent effect. We know that crime, especially violent crime, tends to concentrate in very small places among very small number of people. And so if we are actually solving more crimes, we will see less crimes in the future, which will also mean less incarceration. And so I think there is a longer term win here as well.
Yeah, the double dividend, right? solving more crimes actually lowers the incarceration rate because it lowers crime overall. I think that's a big selling point. Yeah.
They are public speakers and I am not. I think what I'd ask, yes, I just like the smooth talking of these two. I think I would just say that I would like you to walk away knowing that my investigators and my forensic crime lab and my intel people care deeply about their cases, and they're very invested. And they come to work every day wanting to solve every crime that comes across their desk. And so that's what I'd like you to know. And I know that there are times where it seems like we don't care, and it seems like we aren't doing enough, and we're trying really hard, and we can do better, and we can always do better, but that we do really care, and that we want to have trust with the community, and that I care too.
Thank you so much, audience.